Before highways, before cities, before borders, Canada was something else entirely. A vast, breathing world of millions of people, ancient trade routes, and civilizations older than Europe's greatest kingdoms. What did this land actually look like in 1600? The answer will change how you see Canada forever. In the year 1600, there were no cities on the map of what we now call Canada. No roads cutting through the wilderness, no fences marking where one person's land ended and another's began. What existed instead was something far more extraordinary, an unbroken stretch of living land that ran from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific and deep into the Arctic North. The eastern forests were ancient. Trees that had been standing for centuries formed a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground below. These were not just woods, they were ecosystems of staggering complexity, full of rivers that ran clear and cold, and wildlife so abundant it was almost impossible to comprehend. Moose, beaver, deer, and bear moved freely through the undergrowth. The rivers ran thick with salmon and trout. Further west, the land opened up into something breathtaking. The Great Plains stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, a rolling ocean of grass that turned gold in the summer heat. And moving across that grass, in herds that numbered in the tens of millions, were bison. More bison than most people today could ever picture in one place. The ground shook when they ran. On the Pacific coast, the landscape shifted again into something almost otherworldly. Rainforests of towering cedar and spruce rose straight up from the shoreline, their roots tangled in the mist. The ocean here was rich beyond measure. Salmon, herring, halibut, and whale all within reach of the shore. And then there was the north. The Arctic was not empty. It was not a dead zone. It was a world that demanded everything from the people who lived there, and in return, it gave them everything they needed. This was Canada in 1600. Not a wilderness waiting to be tamed, but a living, breathing world already deeply known by the people who called it home. There is a myth that has persisted for a long time. The idea that North America before European settlement was a mostly empty land, with a few scattered groups of people wandering through the trees. That myth is wrong, completely wrong. In 1600, historians and archaeologists estimate that somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people lived in what is now Canada. They were not wandering, they were not primitive. They were organized into nations, sophisticated, deeply rooted nations with laws, governments, trade networks, and cultures that had been developing for thousands of years. In the east, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois, had built something remarkable. 5 nations, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Oneida, and Seneca, had come together under a shared constitution called the Great Law of Peace. This was a functioning democratic confederacy, with a council system that balanced power across nations and protected the rights of individuals. This was happening in North America centuries before modern democracy took shape in Europe. Further north and into the boreal forest lived the Algonquin and Ojibwe peoples. These were masters of the forest landscape. They knew every river, every portage, every seasonal shift in animal migration. Their knowledge of the land was not instinct. It was accumulated science, passed down through generations with precision and care. Out on the Great Plains, the Blackfoot Confederacy commanded vast territories. They had built their entire civilization around the bison, tracking the herds, following the seasons, and using every part of the animal for food, shelter, clothing, and tools. Their relationship with the land was not one of dominance. It was one of deep, practical partnership. On the Pacific coast, the Haida and the Coast Salish peoples had built some of the most sophisticated societies on the continent. They lived in permanent villages, carved magnificent totem poles, and held elaborate ceremonies that served as the social and spiritual backbone of their communities. Their art alone tells a story of a people with immense creative intelligence and cultural depth. And across the Arctic, the Inuit had mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth. Their technology, from the kayak to the igloo, was so precisely engineered for their environment that much of it has never been meaningfully improved upon. These were not tribes of survivors, these were civilizations. Understanding what life actually looked like in 1600 requires setting aside the images that popular culture has burned into the imagination and looking at what the historical and archaeological record actually shows. In the east, the Haudenosaunee lived in longhouses, enormous wooden structures that could stretch up to 30 meters in length, housing entire extended families under one roof. These were not temporary shelters. They were permanent homes, built with engineering knowledge and maintained over generations. Inside, families had their own spaces along the walls, with a central fire running the length of the building. Life inside a longhouse was communal, warm, and organized. The Algonquin people of the forests lived differently but no less skillfully. Their birch bark canoes were engineering masterpieces, light enough to carry over land between rivers, yet sturdy enough to navigate open water. They moved through the landscape with extraordinary efficiency, following the rhythms of the seasons, fishing in summer, hunting in fall, retreating into sheltered winter camps where they had stored enough food to last until spring. On the plains, life moved with the bison. The teepee, often misunderstood as a simple tent, was in fact a sophisticated portable home designed to be assembled and disassembled quickly, to withstand high winds and to regulate temperature in both the brutal summer heat and the deep prairie winter. Everything about it was intentional. The agricultural nations of the East had developed one of the most productive farming systems ever devised, the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash were planted together in a way where each crop supported the others. The corn grew tall and gave the beans something to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil. The squash spread wide along the ground, keeping the soil moist and suppressing weeds. This was not accidental. This was centuries of agricultural science at work, and the trade networks that connected all of these communities were vast. Copper mined around Lake Superior moved south. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico moved north. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountain west moved east. People, ideas, and goods traveled thousands of kilometers through established routes, with trusted trading partners at every stop. What many people do not realize is how connected this world was. In 1600, a piece of copper could travel from the shores of Lake Superior to the coast of what is now Georgia. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico could end up in a ceremony being held in the forests of Ontario. This was not coincidence. It was commerce, organized, reliable, and ancient. The Great Lakes region sat at the center of one of the most active trade networks on the continent. Nations met at designated trading grounds, exchanged goods, made agreements, and reinforced alliances through ceremony. Trade was not just economic, it was diplomatic. It was the mechanism through which peace was maintained across vast distances. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace deserves particular attention here. This was a real constitutional document, carried not on paper but in the patterns of wampum belts, which served as both record and reminder of the agreements made between nations. The Great Law established a council of 50 chiefs, outlined how decisions would be made, and built in protections that prevented any one nation or individual from accumulating too much power. Several historians have argued, seriously and with evidence, that this system influenced the thinking of the American founding fathers when they designed their own democratic institutions. By the year 1600, Europeans had been arriving on the eastern coast of North America for roughly a century. But in 1600, the European presence in what is now Canada was still small, still fragile, and still largely dependent on the goodwill of Indigenous nations. John Cabot had reached the Atlantic coast in 1497. In the decades that followed, French and Basque fishermen began making regular voyages to the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. These early visitors left little behind. They came, they fished, and they went home. But they talked. And the stories they brought back about the wealth of the land began to attract more serious attention. The year 1600 is particularly significant because it marks the establishment of Tadoussac, the first permanent European trading post in what is now Canada, founded at the mouth of the Saguenay River in Quebec. It was here that French traders and Algonquin-speaking peoples began the first sustained, organized exchange of goods. The French brought metal tools, weapons, and cloth. Indigenous peoples brought furs. And in this exchange, the shape of what was coming began to form. Samuel de Champlain, the man who would eventually found Quebec City, was still 8 years away from doing so in 1600, but the groundwork was being laid. French explorers were moving upriver, learning the languages, building relationships, and beginning to understand the geography of a continent that their maps had barely begun to capture. It is hard to overstate how much a hat changed history. In Europe, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, beaver felt hats had become the height of fashion. Every gentleman wanted one. The problem was that Europe's own beaver population had been nearly wiped out, and then word came back from North America. Beavers, everywhere, in numbers that seemed almost impossible. This demand drove the fur trade, and the fur trade drove everything that followed. At first, the relationship between European traders and indigenous peoples was one of relative equality. Indigenous people were not victims of the early fur trade. They were active, sophisticated participants in it. They understood the value of what they had, they negotiated hard, and they used European goods, particularly metal tools, to make their own lives easier and more productive. But the fur trade began to quietly rewire the relationships between indigenous nations. Old trade routes shifted to accommodate the new European demand. Nations that had access to European traders gained advantages over those that did not. Dependencies began to form, subtle at first, then more significant. The world of 1600 was still largely intact, but the forces that would reshape it were already in motion. Of everything that happened in the contact between the old world and the new, nothing was more devastating than disease, and nothing is more consistently left out of the popular story. By the year 1600, epidemic disease had already reached many indigenous communities, often traveling far ahead of the Europeans themselves, carried along trade routes before any direct contact had been made. Smallpox, measles, and influenza hit populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. The death tolls were catastrophic. Some communities lost 50 to 90% of their population within a generation. This fact reshapes how we understand the story of European settlement entirely. When later waves of colonists arrived and found the land thinly populated, they interpreted that as evidence that it had always been that way. It had not. The emptiness they encountered was not natural. It was the aftermath of the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. The land was not empty. It had been emptied. In 1600, the world described in this video was still standing. Languages that had developed over thousands of years were being spoken. Ceremonies that connected people to their land and their history were being performed. Legal systems, agricultural knowledge, medical practices, and trade networks, all of it was functioning. Within 100 years, almost all of it would be under enormous pressure. Within 200 years, much of it would be suppressed, outlawed, or simply lost as populations collapsed and communities were displaced. The Canada that existed in 1600 would become almost unrecognizable. Understanding this moment, this specific year, this specific world, is not just an exercise in history, it is an act of honesty. Because the story of Canada did not begin with European arrival. It began thousands of years before, with the people who built their lives so completely into this land that the land itself still carries the marks of their presence, in the names of rivers, in the paths that became highways, in the crops that feed the world today. The Canada of 1600 was not empty, not primitive, not waiting to be discovered. It was alive, complex, connected, and deeply human. If this changed how you see history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more honest reconstructions of the past.
Exploring the real
story is always more powerful than the myth.